So, in addition to retail electricity prices being forward-looking, right? Rate cases try to project what utilities costs are going to be in the near future and charge a fair price. Rate cases can also be retroactive. For example, if costs end up being higher or lower than expected, utility commissions will keep track of this and then adjust accordingly in a future rate case. And we sort of talked about some ways that costs can be greater than expected, whether that's because demand is higher than expected or fuel costs are higher than expected. But it can take between 18 and 24 months for utility commissions to approve electricity price increases. And this is called regulatory lag. And so what this effectively means is that in the short term, utilities can be exposed to some financial risk by not earning enough money. And so they keep some cushions. They keep cash on hand to help absorb those fluctuations, and they also effectively buy insurance to protect against those fluctuations as well. So we talked about some more conventional ways that utilities might experience higher than expected costs and be in a situation where they're probably not selling electricity at high enough price to cover their costs and also make a profit for shareholders. What are some other more extreme reasons a utility's costs might increase? Well, this is one that we experienced pretty recently. Thankfully, we didn't experience exactly what's shown here on this map, but this is from Hurricane Florence. Hurricane Florence did do significant damage to electric power infrastructure throughout the state, and as a result, Duke Energy had much higher costs this past fall related to cleanup and restoring service to places of the state that lost electric power as a result of this storm. So would a utility commission allow Duke to cover these costs in a future rate case? Well, I think the answer is most certainly yes. As long as the utility commission decides that Duke acted in a prudent manner in terms of protecting its assets from the impacts of a storm, I feel sure that the utility commission would allow Duke to cover those costs in a future rate case. So even though Duke paid a higher cost this past fall, what that might mean is that the additional cost that they paid last year will go into probably a higher price for electricity for customers in North Carolina the next couple of years to sort of pay Duke back for that. Now, here is a more interesting question. This is a picture of the coal ash spill in Eden, North Carolina. So this is one of Duke's coal ash ponds that was undermined and spilled into a surface water body, I think the Dan River, in February of 2014. And so Duke faced enormous cost just in initial cleanup of this accident, and then also faces costs associated with safeguarding the remaining coal ash ponds in the state. Now, it's an open question to some degree whether Duke Energy should be allowed to increase prices on customers to pay for coal ash cleanup. And so this is sort of what your reading was about, and what the Utility Commission most recently found is that they are going to let Duke recover a significant amount of the costs associated with the initial cleanup. Now, what's unknown is whether the future coal ash cleanup is going to be allowed to be put into Duke Energy's rate case in the future. Now, let's think about the case for and the case against. The case for allowing Duke to do this, I think sort of rests on this, the monopoly consensus, right? If you think back to the history of the electric power industry, and I made a point of saying a couple of times that, the goal has really shifted, right? For a long time, the main objective of the electric power industry was to provide low-cost, reliable electricity, and for many years it was a tremendous success in doing just that. And we weren't thinking about environmental externalities, right? So the potential impacts on the environment from producing electricity, whether that's from coal or nuclear or anything. And so that has changed gradually. But the use of coal at power plants in the state and the long-term storage of the residual byproduct of producing electricity through coal and storing that ash in these ponds on site was tied up really in the history of the state's electric power industry. And so what's really happened in some sense is that the costs have been shifted from the past to the future, right? So what we should have been doing the whole time is paying for responsible cleanup of electricity, but who didn't pay those costs and should have are the people who actually use that electricity that was produced through the coal. And that is less and less us today. It is people that lived in North Carolina from 1950 to 2000, and so I would argue that because the people of North Carolina directly benefited from a low price of electricity that Duke Energy was able to provide using cheap, abundant coal, they should also pay for the cost of the cleanup. Now, the case against that, of course, is that perhaps Duke acted in a negligent way, and that because of that negligence, this accident was allowed to happen, and that shouldn't have. And in that case, I guess you could argue that Duke Energy shareholders should be responsible for the cleanup, as opposed to Duke Energy customers. But I do think this is a very interesting and not straightforward philosophical topic that is really tied up in the history of the electric power industry, and it's very difficult, I think, because there is no sort of clear point in history where we decided to start caring about the environment. That happened gradually, and even though those priorities have changed, the business framework that governs the electric power industry in North Carolina has not changed quite as much. So here's another interesting case. So this has obviously less to do with Duke Energy and more to do with electric power utilities in California. So this is a picture of a California wildfire. And I don't know that this is one that was specifically caused by one of the electric utilities, but we talked about this earlier, a little bit earlier in this class, where I referenced the bankruptcy of PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric. So Pacific Gas and Electric for 2 years in a row owned equipment that started wildfires, and those wildfires caused many deaths and enormous losses of property and damage. And so there is a law in California that says that state law that requires the electric power utilities makes them liable for any damages that they cause or their equipment causes, even if they're shown to not have acted with any negligence. In other words, if there's sort of like an act of God and sparks fly off of PG&E equipment, and not because PG&E made a mistake, just because it was an accident, then they are liable to cover all damages caused by the wildfire. And so this is this specific law that holds PG&E accountable without allowing them to pass those costs on to onto ratepayers, led to the bankruptcy of PG&E. This, I think, is a little bit more appealing. The question here is, would we be okay with a utility like Duke Energy increasing prices on customers in order to increase penetration of renewable energy? And we'll talk about why that could happen. But the short answer of it is that what if, for example, Duke Energy decided to double the amount of renewable energy in its portfolio, but didn't retire any other coal plants? In other words, it was still paying the mortgage on all its coal and natural gas plants, and then also was financing all this new renewable energy development. So we'd be sort of like paying double mortgages without an ability to use all the electricity. We'd just use less electricity from coal and natural gas and more from renewables. And this is in some ways what's happened in Western Europe, and in some ways in what's happened in California, the states that have very Areas that have very strong policy pushes towards renewable energy integration have higher electricity costs, and part of that is because they're not done paying with all the old stuff before they start buying the new stuff. And so these are fundamental questions that we have to ask, and that we will continue to ask throughout the rest of this class, that get at the heart of this trade-off between our ability to reduce the environmental footprint, specifically the carbon footprint of the electric power industry, and the price of electricity. Even as renewable energy drops in cost, the capital-intensive nature of the electric power industry and the long horizon investment nature of the electric power industry, where we're paying the mortgage on the infrastructure that we built for a really long time, means that it's really it's not difficult necessarily to change quickly, but it is more expensive to change quickly. And so we're going to have to continue to talk about this as we go. Okay, that's it for this time. Next time, we're going to do a recap of this Inside an Electric Utility lecture series.